Welcome to Things Hidden, our podcast series where we dive into Rene Girard, the ideas of Rene Girard, and the implications of mimetic theory, his work in current events and history and understanding where things are headed. Joining me now is someone who is a trained philosopher. He's a Canadian. He's a good fellow Christian. Craig Stewart, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, David. How are you doing?
Great. So great having you on the program. It's been a little bit of time since we did a podcast together, but I've been really excited about your new series you've launched on YouTube called Battling to the End. It's your overview of Battling to the End, the last book of Rene Girard.
Yeah, that's right. Well, first of all, thank you. It's always great to talk to you and to come and do these conversations. And yeah, I just uploaded this about a week ago, and I think it's a really interesting work, and I'm glad we're going to dive into it.
So first of all, for folks who want to follow along, I'm going to do we're going to do like a reaction video together about, your distillation of some of the highlights of Battling to the End. And as you recommend in the presentation you've done, it's always best to read the book itself to engage in its ideas. So we'll try to pull from some of the quotes that you've pulled from and react to them together. This book was published in 2007 in France, right? And then it came out in 2010 in America. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And so this is his last book. It's considered to be his kind of inscrutable work, right? It's kind of hard for people to figure it out sometimes, right?
Yeah. Well, this is what people say, and also there's a huge variety of different interpretations in terms of what people, well, for the same reason, of what people think that the work is actually saying. So some of the conclusions that I come to here, which I think are right, actually end up painting a bit of a different picture than the way the book is normally treated insofar as I've seen it handled by other people. So
now, when you engaged me recently, but hey, I'm doing this new series on Battling to the End, I've reread it and I've come up with some new insights that I discovered from it that I didn't see the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
What triggered your desire to reread the book, first of all?
Yeah, well, I had read the book when I basically around the time that I'd first started studying Girard. So back in 2012, I guess, was when I picked it up for the first time,
which is a whole nother, like a century ago in our time.
Yeah, well, it's been
50 years at least.
Wow, it's been 10 years I've been working on Girard. Yeah, so I read through it at that point in time, and the conclusions and what I got out of it then was very different from when I went to revisit it for a fresh new time back in I guess beginning the beginning part of mid last year when I went through and started going over it again and again. And then when I started to go through it, I just realized that so many of the contemporary problems in terms of what we're having, in terms of thinking about Girard and how to map Girard into history, and what Girard thinks about history and what the ultimate nature of the theory is. And as Girard says here, and something that I think gets somewhat lost by some interpretations, is that this is his only openly theological work. It's his only openly apologetic work in the full sense of the term. But you wouldn't get that necessarily off first glance from reading it, even though there's certain parts of it that seem more obvious. So ultimately, I think it's a philosophy of history, but not a philosophy of history. It's a working of his theory into a theology of history, which is really exciting and interesting.
He never really wanted to get into theology. Did he do this on purpose, or did he stumble into creating a theology of history?
Well, I think yeah. So I think he's getting so I mean, first of all, it's really important, I think, in order to interpret the text correctly, that the text sets out as a journey. So it's framed that there's going to be development of ideas, and some of the stuff that takes place that seem like conclusions initially early on in the text actually get modified later on as the dialogue develops and as new concepts emerge from within the dialogue.
And for folks listening, who did he dialogue with in the book?
It was Benoit Chantre, and I'm not actually familiar with the rest of his work, so I should go and take a look at more of that. But he's an excellent interlocutor, and clearly, he's able to ask and comment and bring in excellent questions that really move the dialogue in a really creative way.
Is there any indication that Girard kind of manufactured the journey through the dialogue, or did it kind of spontaneously happen through the course of them interacting?
It's not. I don't think it's written anywhere in the text, but I think I remember watching an interview with Benoit Chantre and him, where he's talking with Rene Girard, where they're talking about it. It's
Is this
written
in
as
English or French? This is in French.
it's a European interview. I think it has. I'm pretty sure it had subtitles, so I can't remember. I think you can find it just on YouTube. But I'm pretty sure that they said that they, it's presented as a dialogue, but they spent a long time going back and forth. And there's a there's a big it was edited and revised as well. So I assume that it was going through a whole bunch of ideas and then presented it the same way as Things Hidden, basically, where they worked on it and then revised it and put it into dialogue form.
Mm-hmm. So
but to get back into answer your question that I missed there was the theological stuff that comes in. Girard is always, he wants to distance himself in the sense that he's always kind of going back to the anthropological interpretation. But here he's really trying to say, okay, well, if truth is truth, and if there's a continuity here, then what does the anthropology tell us about theology, and what does it tell us about the meaning of history, and what in terms of where we're at right now, and what the ultimate nature of reality really is. And so there's a tension here of he's trying to leapfrog over philosophy insofar as philosophy evades the detection of the scapegoat mechanism and is therefore incapable of understanding anthropology and therefore generating any kind of
How does philosophy evade the detection of the scapegoat mechanism, briefly, without going too into that? Because that's a lot there. But
yeah, there certainly is. Basically, if you're looking at any philosophy, you can think of the work of, Girard goes into Hegel at length in chapter 2, but you can think of, Schopenhauer, or to a lesser extent Kant, certainly Plato, or any kind of philosophical picture where they're attempting to draw up a picture of the metaphysical totality of reality. And I'm hesitant to use the term metaphysical, but some kind of meta narrative that's meant to explain everything. Well, all of those attempts within philosophy and sometimes within philosophy, the term is used, philosophical anthropology. All of those attempts are trying to give an answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Where does man come from? What is his nature? What is the nature of history in terms of where we come from and where we're going? What's the meaning of our existence here? Well, for Girard, this is quite simple. If we don't understand where it is that human beings came from, what they were engaged in, what they were freed from, where that freeing came from, then you can't answer any of these questions. And so all of those have to necessarily be wrong. If this really is the core central insight that's able to explain everything else. So now,
how does philosophy evade the recognition of the scapegoat mechanism? It doesn't ask the right questions.
Yeah, I guess, Girard, you could say maybe Girard's being a little modest here, but, Girard would just, when he goes back in Things Hidden and he talks about the way that mimesis and imitation has been understood historically, it's always been following the mode of Plato or Aristotle, where it's copying, it's inheriting language and culture and norms. It's models for imitation. It's the whole world of in more contemporary terms, it's the whole world of mirror neurons and reciprocal altruism and the kinds of ways in which biology attempts to explain human eusociality and things like this. All of that's fine, and there's lots of insight there and there's lots of overlap. But Girard says all of this misses the fact that desire is imitative, and if desire is imitative, then we converge on the same objects, and if we can't share those objects, we get into conflict, and then we have the problem of violence. So because it misses that, it's unable to ultimately come up with an adequate explanation for the formation of human culture and human religion and psychology. So it's without that entry point, it's unable to make sense of everything else.
And Girard ultimately discovers that his insights about mimetic relationships and the triangular nature of rivalry and conflict and drama, although he found them originally in the great works of Western literature, he ultimately realizes that their insights from those epiphanies that they get in their books were ultimately coming from the Gospels, right? That the Gospels is what actually influences the climate in which folks like Shakespeare or Cervantes and so forth are able to detect the kind of mechanistic, mimetic nature of human relationships and conflict and resolutions, right?
Well, sort of, right? So Girard in Deceit, Desire in the novel, he's working through this notion of novelistic conversion as it comes about. And for him, this novelistic conversion isn't necessarily explicitly religious. So he uses the example of Holderlin, and a lot of your question here really comes about in chapter 5.
Of battling to the end.
Of battling to the end, that's right. So he uses Holderlin as an example, and Holderlin he has this kind of experience that Girard is drawing out in terms of novelistic conversion, wherein one recognizes that one is being driven by the desires of another, that there isn't this authentic, unique, individual, romantic desire that's uniquely mine, that everything is radically dependent upon the judgments of others in terms of our own states of being, that there's this mimetic process of exchange. For most people, for a lot of them, it becomes religious. Dostoevsky, Holderlin.
Right, but my point is simply not that it's a religious thing that they have to encounter, but rather he says that the insights of where he gets this revelation of mimetic relationships actually comes from the gospel. It doesn't mean that you have to convert to Christianity to experience the understanding of mimetic relationships.
No, I understand.
Your desires, but that he credits it over and over again, that the gospels is what gives us, because he even goes through the gospels and shows, here it is showing the nature of mimetic envy and covetousness here, even before the gospel.
Yeah.
And so he's showing you they don't get to get that insight and become great works of literature without having been baked and saturated in that gospel infection that's been working to the point where those novels and texts come out.
Yeah, I think what Girard would say is that, well, there's a few things. So first of all, Girard postulates explicitly that the modern novel was only capable of really emerging, within this context where already desire had kind of moved away from, this established sacred structure and was more focused on just narrating the experience of desire itself. So this is it's not an accident that it takes until about the 17th century or the 15th century where you start getting these novelists where there's examples before, and obviously there's the tradition of theater and classical culture. But we don't really get the modern novel in the sense of the modern novel until quite late. And so Girard is tracking, of course, in history, this movement of desire moving away from this old sacred mythological structure and towards
and he describes the sacred as like a gas, and you break it and it starts to kind of seep out everywhere, right?
Yeah, the miasma that just influence. Well, and this so that going back to the theology question is Girard says that, and I think he's quite right, is that we have to understand this process of our own situation as being essentially historical, that mankind's own understanding of mankind and the nature of mankind has shifted in history, and it's broken and can be understood along a trajectory that's understandable from the trajectory of mimetic desire. And specifically, there was this injection in history, first with the Jews in the Old Testament, and then later on in the Gospels, that made possible the freeing and the breaking of this miasma of violent closure that doesn't understand itself as violent closure, and then creates the conditions for modernity where the modern novel is able to come about. And these authors have these conversion experiences where they move from this romantic conception of desire to this mimetic conception of desire, which they're then able to articulate
because of the gospel revelation infecting their.
Yeah, well, the gospel was a precondition for it to happening.
That's what I'm trying to say, is that this is a gospel technology effect that enables these kind of profound insights into the nature of human behavior that these authors are being saturated in, that allows them to get those insights. And it's not a quirk that it happened in the way it did in the context of history, as it did in the countries that were saturated with. That's right.
That's
what I'm trying to.
It's just the only small distinction there is just that these, as you already said, it's not explicitly a Christian conversion, but just a conversion into an insight into the mimetic nature of desire. So that's,
but only possible with the impact of Christianity.
Right. Yes, exactly. That's historically. Yeah, exactly.
So now that we've got that, you said that he's going to create his own theory of history, his own theology of history. That's what that ultimately suggesting happens in this book, right?
Yeah, exactly. We can't do a philosophy of history, and indeed we shouldn't. There's no even reason to call it a philosophy of history, because it's something that happened to us, because it's the source of divine revelation. That really,
what's the source of divine revelation?
Well, we didn't come up with the Bible. The Bible wasn't invented. It had to have been revealed to humanity, and because it was revealed.
Why?
Well, because humanity is, for multiple reasons. I mean, First of all of these archaic cultures are dependent upon the closure of the misrecognition of the violence that goes into sacrifice. So to undo that,
wait, unpack that a little bit more, because it's good. It's good that we do this. Refresh. This is an intro video.
Yeah,
These ancient societies are dependent on the closure of the violence.
There has
Why?
to be so in order for the scapegoat mechanism to function effectively, people have to believe and to believe
Right.
in the guilt of the victim and to misrecognize the unity that's bringing them about together,
Right.
as this efficacious ritual that's taking place. The order that's produced is an order exterior to the community, from the community's own perception, even though that order is just simply the production of the
It's a
community.
mass hallucination to some degree, right?
It is. It's a mass misrecognition. It's a mass hallucination.
Mass formation is the new word they're using right now in recent
Yeah,
terms.
this is
That's a
the
psychological term my friend Matthias Desmond
yeah,
has
this
talked
is
about
this
from a
is the
I don't want to go down in psychology.
yeah.
I'm just
Well,
saying
like I
it's
just
similar. It's a mass formation. It's a
yes,
creating.
we could call it that if we want to. But all these ancient cultures, all culture depended upon this misrecognition. So for just in the first place, for a culture to come out and to show and to reveal what's actually taking place in terms of this misrecognition is, from the point of view of the scapegoat mechanism, cultural suicide. The culture shouldn't be able to hold itself together as a result of integrating this knowledge.
And that's why we see cultures that didn't practice ritual sacrifice or ritual cannibalism kind of went out of existence.
They're gone, right? And you even have
Which makes it kind of dry. If you were honest with this, wouldn't an atheist naturally push back and say, what kind of a dark deity would create a reality in which that was the way in which humans could contain their desires, right? Isn't that
well
kind of fair criticism, if we want
we could go down into the road of theodicy and put God in the dock and say it's
right, of course, but specifically in this Girardian point, to put theodicy in that point.
Right? Yeah. Well, let's come back to it a little bit later, because that actually turns out to be a pretty heavy and interesting question to ask. What we
Chapter 5?
No, but what we find right in the introduction is, we see that, God creates God, the way in which we're constituted is ultimately good. It's good for us to be mimetic, right? It's the possibility of so much success that goes into all of our societies. We made this error in terms of our own estimation. We anthropomorphize God in a really tragic way, wherein we projected our violence and our need for retribution and our envy and our petty notions of human pride onto God. And so that's what God's like, and that's what worshiping God is like, and that's what God requires. And God, of course, comes in, and in the person of Jesus Christ, and identifies with all of these victims and undergoes that same tragic false sacred that had been generated for so long. So, from the point of view of theodicy, it's not God who's far off looking down and being so distantly removed from all of this that's going on from him, but he himself who actually undergoes that specific horror and that specific terror to show us the way out of it.
It
So
wasn't his intention necessarily that we would stumble onto the sacred the way we did, where we're cannibalizing each other to contain our violence.
Yeah, I think
that's what we did because we chose to do it that way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's an important point. And as we see in so many ancient cultures, that not everything that they did was terrible. They had reflections on virtue.
A little bit of cannibalism, but they had great songs.
They had great songs. But there was so much rich cultural development that was made possible under the system of sacrifice. There was a lot of injustices too. But
it wasn't that God said it was okay. It's just kind of how we did it, right?
Yeah, and he created us. It's better than being robots, right? That we genuinely are free, and that we genuinely are to actively and consciously participate as agents within creation. But there's so much that is good that goes on in ancient society, so it's definitely not an unqualified bad thing. You see the richness of so many different, and this really comes out quite a bit in this text here too. Even though I think it's been a source of confusion for some Girardian interpreters, the good that is in a lot of other ancient religions that aren't Christian. So there's a lot of good in all of these other religious traditions.
Is there some good in like the more vicious ones? Like,
well, it's harder to find the good in the Tupinamba headhunter cannibal religion, but it's a lot easier to find it in great cultural systems like Hinduism or Islam. great other religious traditions, Taoism. There's a lot of good that's in there that is quite apart from or quite distant and removed from. And the other point too is that just because this revelation has gone out, and just because we've been commanded to love one another, doesn't mean that the 2,000 years since this revelation has been expanding, that we haven't also participated in these in things that could only be described as archaic patterns. And in fact, the whole point of this book is that, having taken away these structures, that we become more violent than ever, that now we commit mass genocides. Now we have the potential for the total destruction of all of humanity in terms of our destructive capacity aimed at each other.
Constant daily global Twitter attacks against a random person caught on video or something.
Right. So it's not like
millions and millions of people showing their wrath and scorn onto one random haphazard person because they did something wrong or the video looks wrong or whatever.
Yeah, and so,
but at the same time, it's also neutered violence in some cases, right?
Well, we've certainly seen an actual progress in history in terms of the old, rather arbitrary sacred structures, most largely arbitrary sacred structures being taken away, and the possibility then of genuine emancipation. So something like the institution of slavery, which had always been a part of human society right from the very beginning, was able to actually be defeated and eliminated, at least institutionally.
Right, it pops up in different ways, but
yeah, well, there's still forms of slavery that still go on today, but there's a global institutional recognition that it is wrong.
Yeah, and we continue to progressively recognize very slowly the more direct forms of subjugation and violence, but we are harder to see how we trick ourselves or misrecognize ourselves conveniently into softer, passive versions of these same kind of soul-rending, violent things, right?
Or we take instances of confusions about we hyperbolically amplify the oppression that we want to be there that doesn't really exist, and create whole other kinds of reverse scapegoating narratives in order to go after the people who we would like to designate as persecutors.
And interestingly enough, every ideology within political discourse thinks that the other side is the victimist and playing the victimhood role, right? Oh, you guys always call yourselves victims,
Well,
we always see them as not justified in their martyr claims, right? Your martyr claims are fraudulent. Mine are legit,
So as the rivals exchange desires and become more and more identical in their desires, they have to latch on to their and more imaginary differences in order to constitute their relationship of opposition to each other. So you find this we find this in less violent terms, although historically it's been very violent. You find the disputes over ever finer distinctions that from the outside of those participants seem almost completely irrelevant, or that they're almost completely identical already. So
I remember that. I mean, just to illustrate that point, that there was like a gay parade that they excluded cisgender drag queens from participating in, because they said, you guys are cisgendered men and we don't want you to participate in this sacred event, and this is not for you, this is for our safe space. And it's like, from the outside looking in, if you're not familiar with that community, you'd be like, why what is
the difference here? Well, if you were to go into society where all forms of same sexuality are still banned, they wouldn't be able to tell you what the difference is in terms of what it is that you're fighting about. So we could find all kinds of examples of this exact phenomena taking place.
But with this release of this gas of the sacred, all kinds of strange things start popping up, right? And it kind of oozes out relative to the relationship between the society and the influence of the gospel text in that society, right?
Yeah, and the convulsions take place in fits and starts and in different ways and in different places. And, there's
so interesting.
Well, if you think of it, one way to think about it is, in terms of any kind of catalytic reaction, you get, if you have a catalyst and you throw it into a reaction, it doesn't spread out all in the same way all at once, right? It works its way in, and you get large runaways in some areas. And
it's kind of like seed oils. They were introduced into the human body for the last 100 years. Just analogy. This is how people learn. Think about it. Go with me. This is how we learn.
Yeah.
We had seed oils come into our system, 100 years experiment. We've done it. And it does different things to different people. Some people it makes obese. Some people stay really thin, but they have autoimmune disorders. It's like it kind of pops up in different ways. It has it's the same giant experiment in some sense, the same phenomenon taking place, but it's going to manifest in different unique local, contexts of the human population. So
Yeah,
just an
of course. And
analogy.
so, like, there's different places where the mimetic terrain has already been very differently modified by whatever came before. So we can imagine, all archaic societies depend upon this misrecognition of the sacred in order to constitute themselves, but the interpretation and the orders that they've developed are very different from each other, right? The Tupinamba headhunters are very different from even certain neighboring tribes further up north in North America relative to South
Just
America.
curious,
So
for those who are familiar with some of these more older religions, how come groups like the Jains didn't have the same kind of sacrificial um, patterns that we would say other, because Girard's going to get into that, into the battling to the end, as he does
that's
in some
right.
other texts. Why
Yeah.
is it that groups like that early on, without having encountered the gospel text, this is kind of like steel manning the premise here, right? Or,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
counteracting the, steel manning the counter argument. Why is it, if this gospel technology of the text so important for understanding human desire and violence and the need to move away from it, what other groups like the Jains are able to see that without having experienced that?
Yeah, there's two key points, one of which Girard develops or talks about. It's just he just drops it on the as an aside in a paragraph in this text. But there's two main reasons that I can think of. The first is what he says here, in that specifically within the Hindu tradition, and Jainism is an evolution of strains of Hindu thought and development, is that if you compare, like, for instance, the violence in the Iliad versus the Mahabharata, which is the foundational text, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, of Hinduism, the Mahabharata is way more violent than the Iliad, and the Iliad is usually the Iliad, if you read it, is an exceptionally violent text. So what Girard notices here is that, and he's developing the point in relation to violence. As violence accelerates and as violence intensifies, it becomes more and more obvious that it is violence, and it is violent exchange. So the more violent forms of these Hindu myths actually increase the capacity of renunciation within that society. They understood with more terror the potential threat of violence and mimetic runaway and escalation, and so had developed prohibitions and practices in order to even further distance themselves away from the potential for mimetic rivals. So you see this enormous capacity for renunciation in Jainism, where they give away all of their possessions. They're hesitant to even damage any kind of animal life, even insect life, and just from this clear apprehension of the visceral danger of the potential for the violent escalation to extremes to break out. So that's one mode of interpretation from an even clearer picture of violence, which is more ambiguous and still hidden in a lot of ways in the Iliad.
Well, what were the mimetic forces that was making those myths more clearly depicting the grotesque nature of violence?
Well, that's too historically contingent, and I wouldn't know enough to say there. But the second point, which
we should be able to look into that, right? Or do we not have?
Oh yeah, enough? For sure. No, you can definitely do.
That's for further research. Then
yeah, you could definitely do a historical analysis. And
what was it that was that? That's kind of what I'm saying, is what was the mimetic mechanism making their myths more honest in the depiction of violence, to make them be able to catechize their communities out of that a little bit,
Yeah, to move more into the mode of renunciation. That's definitely a question that scholars in Hinduism can take a look at and probably provide interesting answers from the point of view of this lens. But the other point too is just that in general, archaic societies, they really use the violence as a pharmacon, as this little bit of violence to stop and to hold back all of the other potential violence that would break out otherwise. If it wasn't contained. And so all of these ancient societies developed very rigorous prohibitions, even rigorous to the point of absurdity, the way that we look on them back today. But what we should expect within any archaic society is this enhanced capacity for renunciation. And
I don't chew with your mouth open,
Well, there's that, but it's also
because in one community I know that if your mouth is open, sometimes they think if you're yawning and you don't cover your mouth, they think a demon's going to sneak out.
Well, you can think of it too. Like think of your own experience. If you're in a bad mood and you're very close with someone and you sit down to eat with them, for instance, you can be irritated by like the way their fork maybe scratches on the plate, or the way that like this is just a feature of our basic psychological constitution. And so it's not a surprise then the interpretation of the potential for a demon is present there, right? It's a demon
because it's making you feel a certain way.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
As the kids say, right? Feel in a type of way, right?
That's right. That's right. So there's this real perceptiveness about the danger of escalation to violent extremes, misunderstood and misapprehended, but that nevertheless goes into the interpretation in really profound ways. And so it's not a surprise that we see in some cultures, just this, like Girard talks about in Violence and the Sacred, the different types of festival, and that there's forms of fasting that have the same logic as the festival, but one does the runaway escalation towards the intentional reproduction of the escalation to extremes in the festival, and the other one renounces even things that would normally be totally acceptable to engage in extreme forms of renunciation, but they're both conditioned off of the same awareness and the reinterpretation of what follows after. So both of those I think
are those festivals in particular. He's juxtaposing different cultures, or within the same culture?
No, different cultures.
Okay.
So yeah.
So the fasting has a different form in different cultures, but it still is bookending the same.
Well, it's anchored more on the prohibitive side of things in terms of recognizing the potential for the escalation to extremes. And the festival side is looking more on if you like the ritual side, where they're re-engaging in the crisis.
They would fast in festivals. I always thought they did more like indulgence and feasting.
No, so there's certain anthropologists who have grouped together what some cultures do, which we would look at as fasting and abstention under the headings of festivals. And so Girard was attempting to say, what's the underlying logic that brings these two together? And it's all of just the apprehension of the dynamics of mimetic rivalry and sacrificial resolution. So the festival side is more focused on reproducing the destruction of the society so that it can be brought back together again through sacrificial resolution, and the other side is focused more on eliminating the potential for that escalation in the first place. So but they're both breaks from the regular patterns of behavior within
they're on ramps and off ramps to the sacred time.
Well, they're all coming out of that same original interpretive matrix. Yeah.
It's not something that will be normative for everyday behavior, right?
No, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so now just to reiterate, because this mimetic history has broken the glass of this gaseous, container of the sacred, now that festival is starting to become normative for everyday life, which is why we're getting into some interesting problems. You see what I
mean? Well, it's interesting.
Like, for example, go ahead.
No, go finish first, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, like example, I saw United Methodists, they're having this big split, the church over the issue of the LGBT and what does the church teach. And one guy was, he said he's a first drag queen pastor,
Okay,
yeah. He said, I'm here to bring festival. Festival is a form of celebration and life, and I'm bringing festival into the church. I'm going to preach the festival and carnival traditions of the ancient past. I'm bringing them here. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, from a Girardian standpoint. That used to be a special time, and now that's becoming the everyday time that we're supposed to normalize as this is the default thing to celebrate, not just, but yet there's still elements of the festival because it's usually really promoted during a particular month, which is kind of a festival pattern. So it's still somewhat there.
Well, the mark of what people tend to focus on when they look at the festival is the transgression of the normal taboos and prohibitions of the society. The difference, of course, within the archaic context is that these festivals have prescribed boundaries, they have limits, they have rules, and if those rules aren't adhered to or followed, then the whole society is in danger of actual collapse. And so, there's some ritual patterns which come too close to the real thing that they're very dangerous, and we can even assume that many societies actually fell apart and disintegrated from their inability to develop rules and structures of interpretation that actually
the whole globe is now in danger of having that happen now because all of that's seeping out.
Yeah, that's right. So all we have, we think of it in terms of the positive.
I'm trying to give people a pitch as to why they need to read this book, Battling to the End.
Well, that's good. Well, if they aren't convinced already, I don't know. Like if you have any interest in Girard, I would say that from a theoretical point of view, it's right up there with Things Hidden. You have to read Things Hidden first, of course, but if you're interested in the development of Girardian theory, it's just such an important work to go through and to learn from.
So you start off in your notes here. I'm looking at your notes you sent me just now. It says, I find Clausewitz powerfully dramatic. He delved into the foundations of modern history in a much more concrete manner than Hegel. He had mud on his boots.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? So Girard is interested in Clausewitz because Clausewitz has the singular intuition, or at least the intuition that Girard really hits upon, that he notices that Clausewitz has hit upon, which is the nature of war as a duel. So in terms of thinking of war as all being reducible to this to a duel, and this duel leads to this escalation of extremes. And so in contrast,
what are extremes?
The extremes of violence, right? The willingness to go and do anything at all in order to defeat the opponent, right? So unlike in previous archaic societies, or unlike within the framework of our modern international order, insofar as it holds together as an order, is we have laws, we have rules, we have structures that we don't transgress, because we realize that for all different kinds of reasons that problems emerge if these rules are broken. Usually we don't always articulate them in the same way, but that we understand the potential for the escalation of violence or conflict to arise, or the breaking away of any possible order that these rules enable. But if all that matters is winning and beating your opponent, then you throw all the rules out in order to overcome that challenge and to defeat your opponent. So that's that's Clausewitz. Girard here is saying, we have these philosophies of history, and so Hegel, for instance, whom
he's the reigning champ of philosophy of histories in this context today, or no?
Well, I mean, he certainly was, right? And Hegel,
you're the philosophy guy. Tell us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Hegel certainly was, and he still has a very large influence. And you can think of not just Hegel, but all of the philosophy.
Marxist view of history is Marxist view of history a nice, just kind of glued on top of Hegel, or does it stand as its own competing narrative?
So Marx does two things principally. Marx says, for Hegel, the realization of all of the ideals that spirit is aiming at or something. So it's a metaphysical idealism. Marx says, no, he inverts that and says that, all that's real, what's real is matter, and that's all that real. And the realization of matter is ultimately the realization. So he inverts Hegel metaphysically and changes him from an idealist to a materialist. And then Marx goes deep on the nature of the material conditions of society, and then from there the economic conditions of society, and the working out of the different tensions between these economic arrangements, and the realization of his end of history, which is of course communism and utopia. So all of this is all coming out of Hegel, and there's still large bodies of thought that are still in dialogue with Hegel, and Girard accuses them all of philosophy, and for Girard, this is the most pejorative accusation within his work, where Hegel is too abstract about the nature of desire and the possibility of reconciliation. And so Hegel has this move of, different people formulate it different ways, and this isn't the way that Girard uses it, but the most common one is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and this is how subjects are born, but it's how culture is born, how history is born, and it moves automatically from one step to the next. You have a thesis, and then you have an antithesis and a synthesis. And Girard, following Clausewitz, says, no, you can have a thesis and then an antithesis, and then the end of everything. There's no automatic reconciliation that comes about necessarily at the end. And so Clausewitz's appraisal of this of what he will develop as Clausewitz's term of reciprocal action as the driver of history is much more realistic, much more concrete, much more in tune with the violent nature of our anthropology than Hegel's metaphysical abstractions. What
was Hegel's basis for believing that there could be a synthesis?
Well, content?
Don't go too far there.
Yeah, no, you're pushing. No, you're putting. Not. I can't go far enough because you're pushing my limits of Hegel, of knowledge of Hegel.
And Marx, did he have a similar resolution mechanism like Hegel there?
So Marx was also optimistic about the way in which human history was necessarily going. That the proletariat would necessarily, because of their increased massive numbers, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and they would be able to realize utopia, and that was just an obvious and rational playing out of
still he thought you needed to have some bloodshed to get it done, right?
Well, that's exactly that's exactly well, and so does Hegel, right? Hegel sees the end of history, and we have to get to chapter
maybe 2. Girard and Clausewitz would say, no, you might shed some blood, but whatever's left is going to come back on you 10 times harder in escalation to the extremes, right?
Well, and that's exactly it, is that you can't say that any of so for Hegel and for Marx, who both believe that there's all kinds of contingent violence and contingent fights on the way to this realization of an ultimate eschaton or utopia that gets built. And Girard says, no, rather than all of these little contingent conflicts leading necessarily to this conclusion, any one of those contingent conflicts could be the end of us all in a situation where we're so technologically enabled and so globalized. And then because there's no automatic switch over to some kind of synthesis or reconciliation, that we have to take Clausewitz seriously and not Hegel in terms of looking at the nature of history and what human violence is about in our anthropology.
Very good. So would you say there's any other competing theories of history that need to be, obviously he takes on Hegel in that quote, and that's why I read it, but
yeah,
any other theories of history that need to be dethroned in the process of this book's points of argument,
not too so
well, like the Whig's view of history. What about the Whig view of history? I mean, that's
the Whig view of history that you could
it's kind of a Hegelian, right?
You could situate it within that Hegelian tradition, right?
It's just a schism of a derivation of it, kind of.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And all of those are derivations of the Christian view of history, right?
Well, they're all,
because they get away from the eternal return of the pre-Christian view of history that was dominant. And they provide a trajectory of history, that the history is going somewhere. It starts in a garden, it ends in a city, or the first miracle of Jesus, where the best wine is brought out at the end of the party rather than the cheap Manischewitz wine, so that wait a second, we're going somewhere. We're not just trying to recapture a bit of the glory from the golden age. So that's a historical statement being made in Jesus' first miracle. So all that kind of gives us an understanding of where Hegel and Marx get this idea of history going somewhere. Right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think you're exactly right. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's really great.
Well, very good. So let's continue now. I want to get into this introduction quote that you got here for us, or we'll pull. This is just pieces from the introduction.
Yep.
And so let me see what we have here.
Are you on the first introduction slide, number 3 there, or?
Yeah.
Yep.
We're just getting started. So it says. It says in the second paragraph, Christianity demystifies religion.
I mean, David. So the reason in the slides here, I'll just say for everyone else, is that I almost pulled out the majority of the introduction and put it.
That's fine. I'm going to read what I like here. Look at this. It says, Christianity demystifies religion. However, Christ also confirmed the divine that is within all religions. So we've kind of touched on that.
Yep.
And how did he define that? How did Christ confirm the divine that is within all religions? Let's just recap that point. Why?
Yeah, so what we find in all of these archaic religions is that when they're occupying the space of the sacred, or when they're making reference to the sacred or to God or to the gods, is that there are aims of these cultures towards transcendent goods that are harmonious with what you find in Christianity. You can talk about lots of people make much of the truth that is harmonious or contained within all religions. And the point for Girard, well, there's multiple points here, but one of the points is that these aims turn out to be real aims. They're not aims at nothing. They're aims at a real other that is really out there. So by they're still
sinful, but they're still aiming at trying to contain worse sins, right?
Well, there's that, right? I mean, like
Jesus, like Paul says that in the past times God winked at your ignorance, and I think that's a reference to this.
Yeah, well, there is the necessity of maturity that comes about from the revelation of violence that's going into the archaic sacred. But like just what we were talking about before in terms of all of the different good elements that were contained within archaic culture, and all of the different good elements that were contained in terms of their understanding of a relationship with God. Some of it's twisted and perverse, some of it's wrong and mingled in with this misapprehension and projection of violence. But there's a lot of positive elements that were in there too. And the important point is that the truth of what it is, of their positive aspirations is a real other. It's not that they're aiming to nowhere. It's not that they're entirely confused that there is a God out there who's interested in them, and that there is a real and authentic sacred.
Even though they think most of the time they're thinking it's many gods, but
yeah, whatever. But they're still engaged in acts of piety and practices of good to one another. There's still lots of charity that's going on, and all of that stuff is good. So there is an element of religious truth in the sense that all of these cultures, no matter how confused they were, did believe in an other, in a God, in a transcendent sacred. So that
I think Paul on Mars Hill helps see that, though. You know what I mean? He says,
yeah, that's great.
like, look at this unknown God here. You know, that's like in all the other reasons to sacrifice people. You know, it's like almost like covet. It's almost like the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt not covet," and everything else that would lead you to sacrifice. The unknown God's like the etc. You know, like every other hidden reason to have. You have a God for wine. You have a God for war. God for this. God for that. Look, every God I'm going to show you is this pathway and this unknown God, this other that is actually behind all the gods you've already developed. Your placeholder God is actually this unknown God that's actually hidden behind these victims that you've covered up. And I'm not saying he's thinking in the way that Girard's thinking there, but I see that there in the text.
So what you're emphasizing there is, well, I mean, it's not univocal in what you're saying, but there's a continuity and there's a discontinuity with all forms of archaic religion. So the continuity is all of the good stuff. The discontinuity is the misapprehension of the worst of violence, the forms of sacrifice that give us this very perverse notion of who God is and what the nature of goodness is and what the nature of piety.
But just think of the textual, like the double entendre behind the unknown God.
Yes,
right. You see the textual humor there.
Like
I mean, it's brilliant.
That's very beautiful and very
it's very meta there. You know, it's like you read that if you want to read it with a Girardian frame, you see some meta there. You know,
no, that is very clever. But I think what Paul is actually emphasizing there is that he's talking about. I think he's pulling it from. I can't remember. It might be Empedocles. I can't remember which.
By the way, the patristics would encourage us to look at the text like this with this.
That's quite brilliant, man. That's really cool. But Paul's talking about God in whom we live and move and have our being, and he's quoting an ancient philosopher. I think it's Empedocles, but I can't remember exactly who it is. And so this understanding that we live and move and have our being inside of God, that these ancient cultures understood that they were participating in some kind of sacred life. That is affirmed to be a reality within Christianity. That's not. And
why do you think he says in the past times God winked at our ignorance?
Well, because we had no way of knowing, right? I mean, Christ on the cross, what does he say, right? To the people who put him to death was, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." We really didn't understand and couldn't understand, and still often don't understand the mechanisms of violence in which we're caught up in, and the confusions that we attribute to the divine. So for the Marxists, right? When the Marxists are slaughtering millions of bourgeoisie
in the name of their God,
they believe they're doing something good, right? They believe they're doing something good.
Do you think all of them did, or did some of them?
Okay,
right.
We could. This is a separate. Some of them did. I mean, there was
because by then the sacred had been deconstructed enough that they should have been in on. Some of them should have been in on what they were doing.
Well, it's
you know what I mean.
Well, this is an aside, but if you actually go out and look at what the Soviet leadership was like, especially during the time of Lenin, they were true believers. Like they really believed in the truth of communism and the truth of their principles. And so you can imagine that
but Stalin still had a bigger house than his comrades. Come on, man.
Yeah, but they really believed in the truth of Marxism. They actually believed in the metaphysics. They actually believed in the end of history. And so they believed that their lesser bit of violence, their lesser bit of violent extermination was ultimately justified, right? For reasons of doing the greater good from their from their.
And they almost see it like their
interpretation.
And I almost think that they see like some of the impulse to revolt, to be repulsed by their own violence is a form of sacrifice in their version of religion. Like
that's right.
Going through this killing, it's destroying me. And in that process of conflict and cognitive dissonance, I'm offering up a sacrificial gift to the God of my cause.
That's right. You have to renounce you have to renounce your very natural feelings of horror and revulsion that you feel in what you're engaged with in order to do the great sacred work of realizing communist utopia. That's
by the way, that still exists today with a lot of the more modern ideologies and the things they require of their adherents. It's true.
That's right.
We'll just leave that there. But just to reiterate, don't you see that Christianity demystifies religion? However, Christ, you have a ... However, Christ also confirms the divine that is within all religions. So that divine, I think, is kind of highlighted with what Paul says on that Mars Hill sermon, because he's, God God looked past your ignorance in the past.
Mhm.
There's a kind of God grading on a curve there around the world, right? I mean, it is. Yeah, you guys were doing pagan savage sacrifices in various ways, but you were also, nice to each other too sometimes.
Well, no,
And that kind of helped you be nicer, right? By having that. So it's like you didn't do it the right way, but I understand deeply, empathetically why you did it.
Yeah, that's right. And you can. And
that's what we need to have, by the way. We need to imitate that posture when we engage in modern forms of collective violence and tyranny that we don't like, right?
Well, that's right. And Paul also talks about, first I gave you milk, and now I'm going to give you the solid food, and you see the same as
so milk is sacrificial religion.
That's right, and the training wheels are coming off of human culture and human society, where you're going to have to really actually do this really strange thing of actually loving your brother. Which
and the bumper, I like to say the bumpers of our bowling game are coming off, and now you got to bowl a striker. You're going to go in the gutter, You
got to really bowl. That's exactly right. And that's what we see happening is God entrusting humanity to become to put away childish things and to become adults. And we'll see if humanity is actually going to be capable of going on this journey to adulthood.
So the incredible paradox, this is continuing from your introduction quote that you pulled here.
Yep.
The incredible paradox, which this is Girard, which no one can accept, is that the passion has freed violence at the same time as holiness.
Yep.
The sacred, which has been returning, quotes, for 2,000 years, is thus not an archaic form of the sacred, but a sacred that has been satanized by the awareness we have of it. And that indicates, through its very excesses, the imminence of the second coming. Let's unpack a little bit of that.
Well,
in 5 minutes.
You could say this is why I just had to take out so much of the introduction.
No, I love it. That's why I'm just mining the gold here.
Yeah, I mean, what you could say, and I brought in the whole so much from the introduction to put in the introduction here because I just thought the introduction was so good that it really needed to be reproduced in full because so much is in there. And you could say that the rest of the book is actually working through what he's saying right here in these.
Right. Yeah. This is like his thesis statement of the book.
That's right. And so the kind of violence that is becoming more and more manifest to us today is becoming more and more manifest to us as violence. It's not hidden under the veils of mythology or under the veils of belonging to God, but it's our own violence, which is more and more revealed. And the more it's revealed to us as violence, does two things. It can lead to the potential for the runaway of the escalation to extremes and more violence, or it also creates the potential for us to see what it is that really taking place and to make this leap from one order of way of being to a different one entirely.
In which we're not going to do a revolutionary violent overthrow of this nasty stuff, but we're not going to make allies with oppressing other people either. We're not going to take either side. We're going to find another path, right?
Well, and this is I'm just gonna on that point, I'm just gonna jump ahead to the next slide to the very end. Girard is this is the last pair. Well, people listening or watching don't have it in front of them, but Girard ends off here by saying, "Does not Christ invite us to be more cunning than the serpent?" And he's really so Girard is saying, I'm bringing in Clausewitz as a strategic thinker, and we're looking at mimesis as this motor of reciprocal action that's engaged in history, and we're looking at history through these mimetic dynamics that unfold over time. It's not that Christians can just Christians need to bring all of their talents to bear and to really think creatively of how it is that we can, awaken the gospel and spread the gospel, not just to save people in the metaphysical terms of the way that Christians have always understood it, but even just in the very existential way of creating the conditions of possibility for humanity to continue and for us to have a history going forward. So there's a real urgency and a real demand for us to not just be naive about anything, but to get really creative and really cunning that we're in an actual war with violence, and that we.
Why are we in a war with violence? That sounds almost like the way you said it. Not that you intended that way, but it sounds almost utopian.
Well, what we see in terms of, and this is going to come out. This is going to come out throughout the rest of the text. Is that we're going to see that there's this fundamental opposition between truth and violence. So that violence is always as passions escalate to extremes, and as people's identity becomes, the identity of their desires becomes more and more identical. That is the mutual and absolute elimination of the other. As these become identical, they depend on difference that they imagine that the other has in order to hold off their identity of opposition and to understand how they're different and what makes them right in their violent crusade of eliminating the enemy opposition. This when that opposition is a fundamental lie. It's the lie of not being able to see the other who you're in opposition to as another human just like you, another sinner who's caught up in the same violent dynamics, someone else who's engaged in the exact same patterns of behavior, and that you've exchanged blows between throughout the entirety of your interaction, and has been caught up in a process that is largely in some ways unconscious, since they're depending upon their understanding of their differences from each other in order to sustain it, unable to realize and to see the other as another like themselves, and to make this transition from an identity of violent opposition, which puts in an arbitrary difference, versus an identity of love, which can then have differences afterwards, but always starts first from seeing the other as another like yourself. So one example of this kind of difference between violence and truth is, you could say, sometimes during war, when it takes place, is that there's massacres of whole populations, and there's these atrocities that are committed, or sometimes in going after, some people have committed crimes that are so horrific, and so you're tempted to break all of the rules, to suspend all law, to break all of the rules in order to bring about remedying this great injustice. At the same time, you have this other tradition within law and within international relations, where you see, no, people have basic rights, and you need to be able to offer them the chance to surrender. If they surrender, you need to accept their surrender. You need to treat them humanely and decently, and there's a basic human dignity that needs to be honored, even if we're engaged in a real fight. And so from there, you can kind of get you can see this primacy of victory above everything else, in contrast with what concept Girard's going to develop, the primacy of battle, which says, even if we're engaged in this struggle and this tension, I'm still going to remember that the other is another just like myself. And
see, that word primacy of battle is such a confusing title for that, because it sounds like I'm fixated on the battle, but it's not. It's about understanding the empathy involved in the conflict.
Well, Girard is being really cheeky in the development. I mean, the book is titled "Battling to the End," and I think it's from this development of the concept of the primacy of battle that he works through the whole way, because he sees that we're in this actual struggle. We can't, and he criticizes his own position in Things Hidden, where he says, in Things Hidden, I thought I could get this non-historical outside position where I could stand and judge violence in these absolute terms, and instead, we're embedded in this mimetic history, and we're embedded within our mimetic relationships, and so we really have to think within mimesis in terms of how it is that we can actually win the war for truth against violence, and therefore preserve the possibility of humanity existing at all.
But the action of the opponent is going to draw you magnetically into making a reciprocal action, and the way you do that has to be intentional and laced with the grace and mercy that Jesus provides for us.
Yeah, and additionally too, the reason that it's a battle is that there is all kinds of there is a real violence is quite happy to make victims and to trample and to engage in all manner of oppression. If you're on the side of truth, you're on the side who's saying, no, that oppression is just oppression, and there's a reality of an authentic kind of victimage. And how do you do this without then becoming persecutors in the name of the whole text is where I think it's so important as a text, just in terms of developing a strategic response to all this.
How can and I'm thinking of like what Jesus did with the story of the woman accused of adultery, right? And this idea of like, he's locked in a battle there. He's trying to save the life of this woman, and he's in a conflict with the crowd, right?
And he can get stoned, right? Yeah.
He doesn't tell them, do not do that. That would have got him stoned and himself, right?
Yep.
He doesn't say, don't you dare hit this woman. That's typically, I want to put a point here, that's typically how traditionalists and conservatives tend to respond to the left. Don't you dare do this egregious, flagrant thing. Oh, you will not. We're going to get you back. that posture gets you mowed over and you lose the victim too, right? Because the victim is going to get stoned after they stone Jesus. But that's not what he does, right? So he does an Aikido move, what I call social Aikido. And he says, I'm actually going to tell you to go. I'm actually going to look like I'm going along with you by saying, okay, you want to do that? Let's do it. Who's going to cast the first stone? So he didn't tell you not to do it. He didn't tell you do it. He does something that's kind of this Aikido battling to the end thing that I think Girard is going to get out, right?
I think you put your finger like on the exact right text. That's the perfect text for thinking about exactly what this work is trying to develop, is to hone in on what is Jesus doing there. He's trying desperately not to inflame the mimetic hostility and reciprocity of the crowd. He's trying to save the woman's life, and at the same time, and everything is in there. He's trying to preserve the goodness of the prohibition, in the sense that no, adultery is bad. It's a source of mimetic rivalry. If it, but what's the greater sin? Her sin or the sin of the crowd? Which goes, the real revelation in that story is not the woman is guilty, but that the crowd is guilty, right? That's the real big revelation that takes place in that. And it almost you don't even find that in the text. I mean, you do find it, but it said it's not gestured at it. It's not gestured. He doesn't go and forgive the crowd, right? He forgives her. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. The crowd just kind of.
And as I always say, the traditionalists among us tend to want to stone the woman because she was accused of adultery, because that's such an inflammatory thing that will destroy society if left unpunished. And the leftists among us want to stone Jesus for telling her to go and sin no more.
No more.
Right?
That's exactly right.
And that's where we're caught in this dialectic of the Hegelian dialectic, and Girard is going to help show us how the gospel helps us get out of that in this book.
Well, and I just, I think you've hit on the exact right text, because that story is really a perfect example of what Girard is looking for. He's saying, like, what is Jesus doing in that scene? Not like, as he said perfectly, not giving something that will inflame a pattern of rivalry with the crowd, but rather a revelation of what it is that's really going on, that they're caught up in this thing that they didn't even realize that they're caught up in because of their adherence to the law and looking for. So we have to learn, and as you say all the time in your program, we have to really study what Jesus is doing in terms of his social Aikido, because we're in this desperate conflict that we have to win. We're battling to the end. We have no choice.
And so the question is, how do we become wise as serpents and gentle as doves, as Jesus did in that scene? That's where we're going to leave off.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
All right. Thanks for your time, Craig. We'll leave it here as a little cliffhanger. And thank you for your time. And I want people to check out your YouTube channel. Look for Craig Stewart, right?
That's right.
Craig Stewart on YouTube, and you'll be able to follow along with his new presentation on Battling to the End. And we will regroup in a upcoming episode and unpack further in the book. How about that?
That sounds amazing. Yeah, if you just search Craig Stewart or Craig Stewart, Rene Girard, or Craig Stewart Battling to the End, there's a lot of Craigs out there.
Yeah,
sometimes you don't get that. But no, this is such a joy, David, and what a great conversation. And I'm very much looking forward to the next one.
All right, take care.
All right, you too. God bless.